Guan, the U.S. has put much of the onus for resolving this situation on the Korean Peninsula on China. We even heard President Trump say at one point that China needs to do something. If China doesn't do anything about this, then we will act on our own unilaterally. And just this past weekend, we heard John McCain, the senator from Arizona, talking about this. He was talking on a U.S. political show, a talk show called Meet the Press. Let's take a listen to what he said.
China is the key. They can stop this if they want to because of their control over the North Korean economy. And by the way, I would point out, and I know this will come up later on, but there are artillery on the border between North and South Korea that can reach Seoul. And we can't take them all out before. I mean, this is a very serious, this may be the first test of this presidency, but China can shut them down, and we should be, whether they're currency manipulators or not, we should expect them to act to prevent what could be a cataclysmic event.
So everything is being pointed to China right now.
Well, yes, I think in addition to my colleague in Beijing just said, I think it's worth pointing out that China, in fact, stopped exporting 160 types of technology, softwares, and equipments to Pyongyang, to North Korea. And also, we see a slowdown of tourism to North Korea. If you talk to Dandong, this border town travel agencies, and also Air China, China's flagship carrier, it's said to have reduced flights to Pyongyang. All that taken into account, I think China is in a very difficult situation right now. On one hand, according to our Chinese sources, Beijing does prioritize its relations with the United States. We can see that from the summit meetings between the two presidents. It wanted a great relationship, a great start of a relationship with the United States, with the Trump administration. So to some extent, I think Beijing is willing to accommodate Washington's concerns. But on the other hand, after all, Pyongyang and the North Korean issue is an issue derived from the Cold War. China has long seen North Korea as a strategic asset. So to hedge against America's militarization of the Asia-Pacific area.
Yonho Kim, the United States says that...
Can I add something?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you know, like our previous speakers, you know, both of them talked about, like two of them talked about, and also, of course, Senator John McCain talked about, like, key is China. But I think there's a sort of like misperception here. You know, you have to understand what North Korea wants really from this confrontation with the U.S., with South Korea. What they want is really a security guarantee from the United States. So what they want is a promise the U.S. will not attack North Korea. What they want is not a regime change in North Korea. So it's like China cannot promise them. China cannot guarantee North Korea that there will not be attack from the U.S., that not will be a regime change from the U.S. So ultimately, it's really between North Korea and the United States to solve this problem.
So, Dr. Paal, are we ultimately talking about a peace treaty here? That's what the DPRK wants?
That's one of the things they want. There's quite an extensive list. When we've had close to the end negotiations with North Korea in the past, their list keeps growing out of Japan, out of South Korea, peace treaty, aid, recompense for the war, all sorts of things that are just politically impossible. So we have to go into any negotiations understanding they're going to play that game. But I do think a smart administration move would be to have packaged a coalition effort, multiple nations around North Korea, trying to put on the table all the things that they want in exchange for giving up those programs. I doubt very much North Korea would take it, but if you want to hold a coalition together to go on to sanctions and other things you may have to do, you should start with a major peace effort. Now, we have a problem in that the new administration in Washington doesn't really have any diplomats at the top. They're all military people. Right. And inexperienced people in this part of the world. And so it may take some mistakes and experimentation before we get to that outcome.
So the most extreme actions would be the actions of last resort then?
Well, I would certainly hope so.
Right.
For the reasons John McCain mentioned in his tape.
Yeah, Yonho Kim, the United States says it's going to go ahead with its anti-missile THAAD system. It will deploy that in South Korea. There, of course, the United States has military troops on the border, 28,000 troops there. It also has naval vessels in the vicinity. Is any of this acting as a deterrent?
Yes. It has been, very strong force against possible North Korea's, provocations. But we have seen the sinking of Cheonan and Yeonpyeong Island shelling in 2010. So I hate to say this, but North Korea has been very creative, if you will, in planning their provocations. And both the U.S. and South Korea has been very weak on this front.
Right, that is true. But if we listen to the response from the United States that's coming out now, let's take a listen to what Vice President Mike Pence said about the response that the DPRK could face. Let's watch this.
We will continue to deploy the THAAD missile defense system as a defensive measure called for by the alliance and for the alliance. We will continue to evolve a comprehensive set of capabilities to ensure the security of South Korea. And as our Secretary of Defense made clear here in South Korea not long ago, we will defeat any attack and we will meet any use of conventional or nuclear weapons with an overwhelming and effective response.
They have to be hearing that in Pyongyang, right?
Right.
What would they make of that?
Well, first of all, I'd like to emphasize on the resolution of both countries, the U.S. and South Korea, to deploy the THAAD against the North Korean growing threat from North Korea. But what I understand is both the U.S. and South Korea have agreed to let the next South Korean government make finalize the installation of the THAAD deployment. Although their stance is basically that there's no change in their deployment plan. And Moon Jae-in of Liberal Democratic Party, he's the leading presidential candidate, has called for a review of this matter by the next government. But I don't think he has much room to cancel the decision, especially when you have growing tension on the Korean Peninsula. And he even said last week that if North Korea keep provoking, then there is no choice but to the South Korean government but to keep going with this THAAD deployment plan.
Right.
So that's the fact on the ground in South Korea, I think.
Guan, there are reports this weekend, this past weekend, even some evidence from satellite images that the DPRK was planning another nuclear test. It didn't go ahead with that nuclear test. It did go ahead with a missile test, and that failed because the missile exploded on takeoff. But getting back to the nuclear test, do you think the reason it didn't carry it out was because of pressure from China? Did China say, don't do this?
I think to some extent, but to what extent, it is a myth, because the last time a senior North Korean official visited China was 2 months ago when it sent its vice foreign minister to Beijing and met with Wang Yi, China's top diplomat, China's foreign minister, rather. But also, don't forget, the last time, before that meeting, the last time a North Korean senior official visited China was 9 months ago. So there was a 9 months period in which there were no senior North Korean officials visiting China. And also, Kim Jong-un assumed office 5 years ago, and he hasn't met up with President Xi Jinping once, not once. So there is obviously a cooling down, at least at the level of heads of state and cabinet levels when it comes to exchanges. So it's also a myth that North Koreans' nuclear capabilities can really strike continental United States. You know, this past weekend, I talked to Raphael Wolber, a senior journalist from APTN who has been reporting inside North Korea for the past 15 years. It's like the more reliable sources indicate that perhaps the North Koreans can launch a missile, hit the island of Guan, but to say that it can successfully launch a missile, making sure it runs smoothly and making sure it explodes at the precise location is on the continental United States is a bit of a far-fetched media hype.
But is there a recognition that there could be a missile that could reach South Korea very easily?
Yes. I think a respected U.S. Nuclear scientist, Reed Hector, visited the North Korean Yonbyon nuclear site a few years ago, and he was surprised at the centrifuge devices at work in Yonbyon facilities. And he's saying that basically the nuclear capabilities of North Korea is developing at a very fast pace, perhaps faster than the outside world had predicted.
Okay. Qinduo, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has also been calling for calm. Let's listen to what he had to say.
China has always resolutely opposed any moves that would increase or provoke tensions. History has proven that weapons cannot solve problems, and that dialogue is the only way out. On the issue of the Korean Peninsula, it's not about who can say the most hateful words, about who can raise the biggest fist, who will win. Rather, once war breaks out, there will be losses on all sides. No one is the real winner.
So, Qinduo, does the Foreign Minister have a point there, that there are going to be no winners if this breaks out into conflict?
Obviously, if there's a military conflict or rather a war, you can see, of course, North Korea will be suffering hugely from the U.S. attack. But also remember, the city of Seoul, South Korean capital, will be well within the range of North Korea's artillery. The city of millions of people will be destroyed. And also China and South Korea will also be suffered from the influx of refugees from North Korean side. At the same time, remember, the United States will not remain intact because North Korean officials right now are talking about a preemptive nuclear strike with their own way, their own style. We don't know what kind of attack that could be, but obviously it's very hard for the U.S. To be free from any retaliation from North Korean side. So everybody will lose if there's escalation of tension, if there's a military conflict in the Korean Peninsula.
All right, Douglas, this is a bit of a cliche, but we've been here before, haven't we?
I was thinking deja vu all over again. This is something we go through every year. As I said earlier, the new factor here is the arrival of a Trump administration with new people showing up in South Korea, saying what things I would have written 25 years ago. All cards are on the table, no options are dismissed. You're on guard. But even the description in the press of the arrival of the Vincent battle group as supposed to escalate the situation. Well, actually, the Vincent is going in to replace the Reagan, which is in a repair yard, and the nearest other carriers are on the west coast of the U.S. So actually, there are no carriers near the Korean Peninsula this week, and there won't be until the end of the week. So I think there's too much tension built into the commentary.
Yeah, there was an interesting interview in the Los Angeles Times. They interviewed the former Defense Secretary, William Perry, and he said that the United States was on the verge of attacking North Korea, the DPRK, in 1994. In fact, war plans were ready. They were about to launch this, but they backed down at the end because they thought, well, the consequence. He said so. He said, we considered the consequences and decided that this attack should not go ahead.
Bill Perry is a wise man, and he understands the situation quite well. By the way, they also had a sort of not terribly well-coordinated diplomatic initiative in 1994 where Jimmy Carter went over and sort of broke the ice and got the situation created where actual diplomatic talks could proceed.
Yeah, Yonho, sometimes we forget that there was a diplomatic roadmap which was already in place, the six-party talks. That hasn't gone away. It's still there. Could it come back? What would a diplomatic solution look like?
Well, as you said, everybody knows, I think, as far as all the parties involved in the North Korea problem understands that there's no viable military solution to this. So I think the South Korean government, the next South Korean government, has some kind of mission, if you will, to come up with creating some room for diplomatic solutions here, because both the U.S. and North Korea, they're playing kind of a brinkmanship game for now. So I think all the leading candidates in South Korea, they prefer a dialogue to confrontation with North Korea, although they are all emphasizing the importance of maintaining sanctions on North Korea. And again, I think on day one, the next South Korean government would seek for a diplomatic solution.
Guan, very quickly, we have a minute left. Something we forget sometimes is that China and the DPRK are treaty allies. They signed a treaty in 1961, the Sino-North Korea Treaty. And under the terms of that treaty, China is obliged to come to the DPRK's rescue if it is attacked, if there is outside aggression.
But the wording of that treaty is very interesting. It has its own conditions. It says if there were an unprovoked war against each side should come to each other's defense. So say if North Korea launches attacks preemptively against another country, the ROK or Japan, I'm not sure if that treaty covers North Korea. And also, the treaty is really about, the exact wording in Mandarin was military, the two sides will offer military and other assistances. So that does not equate to military strike, as in the U.S. would defend Japan, as in the treaty allies. So I'm not sure if that wording makes China and North Korea exact treaty allies, but it's an alliance of some sort.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us.